Okay, so I was going to make this part of another video, but I decided to make this on its own, and this is how to set the Niagara particles up to only interact with the surfaces you want it to, while also preserving all of your ragdoll capabilities. So this will make a lot more sense once I explain it a little bit, but basically the Niagara particle system doesn't have collision layer filtering built into it at the moment like the Cascade particle system does. So in the forums, the developers have said this is a feature they plan to add, but until they add it, you have to work around the particle collision system instead of having the particle collision system work for you. So this is basically how to set that up really quickly. So I'm just going to make a few changes here to the zombie. So this is how your zombie will normally be set up by default. And I just want to disable physics as well. So when you spawn the zombie, usually you're going to run into this problem straight away. There's floating decals, it looks terrible. So a really quick way to fix that is I added in this collision timer offset. So you can add in 0.25, which is the default, and that will stop the collision happening for the first 0.25 seconds. And it works a little bit better, but it's not perfect. There are still some cases, depending on the animation or the ragdoll, where you might get some overlap after 0.25 seconds. So it sort of works, but there's a better way to do it. I'm going to keep that in there as part of update 1.2 because it has its uses, but overall you're better off not using this and instead changing the collision properties. So if we change the collision on our enemy that we're attacking from overlap block to overlap, from block world dynamic to overlap world dynamic, when you spawn these particles, even with the collision timer offset set back to 0, the particles work as intended now and only collide with what they're meant to collide with. And this will also work if we set it to ragdoll. So the only limitation you're really going to run into here is, now that we've changed this world dynamic to overlap, is if you have a movable object, normally the ground's going to be static, but let's say we're on a moving platform or something like that. If you're on a moving platform and the collision is set to just what this is what it's set to by default, block or world static. So when we simulate this, the ragdoll works fine. When we simulate this at movable, the ragdoll falls through it. So this is only happening because we changed the zombie to overlap world dynamic. So if we set this back now, the zombie works again. So you might be asking, you want to keep your ragdoll in and use my particle effects. So we change the actor back to world overlap on the world dynamic, and when we go to the movable platform, whatever this is, at the moment it's just a plane, but if we want this to be movable, you need to change the collision presets to custom, and you need to change the object type from world dynamic to physics body, and keep everything else the same, because if you change this to overlap, the ragdoll will work, but the particles don't work now. But if we change this just to block all and just keep this at physics body, the ragdoll will now work and the particles will now collide as intended. So another thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to disable the physics just because the animation lines the particle system up nicer. You'll notice here that this sphere, for consistency's sake, I'm going to just set this back to default. It's world static object. The blood is colliding, it's spawning things on the wall, so we don't want this. This particle system, it will spawn tens of thousands of droplets on the ground, but you need to use projected decals to spray the decals onto the wall. Combine these together and you get a really great result. So if we change this to custom and we set world dynamic to overlap, the particles will now ignore it and just simply travel through it, which isn't the most ideal situation, but again, it's going to look very convincing when you have it in your game, especially when you have this many decals spawning. So I'm going to change this zombie now back to physics and just show you one last time how we can work with these different things. So the zombie's colliding with this at the moment, and if we set this to movable, it's still going to collide. So the only point at which it doesn't collide is if I believe we set this to world dynamic. and that's when it stops colliding again. So if we set this to world static or physics body, again, same for this one, we could have set this to world static as well. You'll find that the collision works properly again. And we can even enable simulate physics on this, and the zombie will still react to it. So that is how you can get around the limitations with this particle system, and how you can set up the collisions to work properly. So I hope this video helps, and like I said, when they add the feature to add the collision filtering to Niagara, I will be updating this product immediately. So yeah, this is the main actor that you'll spawn when you're spawning a particle, and this actor controls all of these exposed variables inside the different Niagara systems that we have set up inside here. So if we have a look, we've got, I'll change this to something else. We'll change it to the dismembered spurt. That looks pretty cool. So we've got a heap of different things here. We've got the decal timeout. So if we set that to something really small, you're going to see that they come in and they fade out. If you set it to something long, like 2 minutes, they're going to last a long time. You can set this to pretty much whatever you want. These decals are going to be cheap, into the tens of thousands, and yeah, as long as you're not spawning like hundreds and hundreds of emitters, you're not going to have any problem with the decal lifetime existing there in the background. So we've got the particle amount coefficient that changes how many spawn. So this can be useful if you want to quickly modify the systems. You can also just change these systems inside and completely customize them, but this gives you quick and easy control, especially if you want to randomize it a little bit and do things like that inside your blueprint. You can really take this a lot further. So we put it back to 1. You can spawn even less, and you know, you can get a lot of different effects, which is pretty cool. So we got the gravity coefficient as well, and that does what you expect. So as you lower it, it will lower the gravity, and you can make this a negative number as well, so that's really shooting up now. We'll put that back to 1, 2, we'll put that, yeah, there. So we got the particle lifetime coefficient as well, and this is probably good to see. If we put this down to 0.5, 0.1, you'll see that the particles are dying. Some of the other particles are surviving from the splash, but they are actually stacking up in the air. When the particles die, that's when they leave the decal, and the particles die on collision. So we'll set that back to 1. That's high enough, but if we set this to something like 0.2, the particles are going to start dying in midair in some cases. So if you're playing with the gravity and the velocity, usually you're going to want to increase the particle lifetime coefficient, just so the particles live long enough to hit the surface that they're meant to hit. So just keep that in mind. We'll set that back to where it was. So we got the emitter duration coefficient, and this controls how long the emitters inside the particle system will last for. So if we have the puncture wound, for example, this is meant to simulate like getting stabbed with a knife. Okay, so if we increase the emitter duration, here we have it at 0.1, it ends almost straight away. At 1, it lasts for a couple of seconds, and if we change it to like 5, it will last for 5 times longer, and you'll see that it will just keep bleeding over time. And this can be very useful when you sort of want to drag out the bleeding effect, and can give some very convincing results. We've got some obvious ones here, like the decal scale coefficient. I'm just going to change this back to the, I like the mild dismembered personally. I'm going to change the decal scale coefficient, so we can increase the size of these bad boys, or we can scale them down. And sometimes less is more, and they look pretty awesome when you make them small, especially with the splashing around them. So another setting we have here as well, which I really like, and this can sort of give you some Grand Theft Auto 3 looking blood almost, with the spurting. So if we change the droplet scale here to something like 10, and then we change the droplet tail scale, we change to 10, and then we change the droplet scale itself to 0.5. Let's try a bit longer. There we go. You can get more of yeah, that's pretty cool. I like that. And we can change the droplet scale back a little bit. Yeah, I think that's a little bit nicer. So that's what those two variables are there for. You can make some pretty cool effects with these, especially when you change the gravity and the blood sort of starts shooting out. are we going here? There we go. So I'm not sure exactly when you'd want to do some of these things, and this is a case where we'd have to increase the particle lifetime. But you know, you can do different effects with this blood and have it simulating in slow motion and things like that. Or simulated slow motion anyway. So we'll turn him back around and I'll keep going through this list. So we got the sprite scale as well. That changes the size of the initial sprite burst at the start. So usually this effect less is more. The next one is the velocity direction coefficient. So by default it is shooting out, well in this case it is shooting out in the x-axis, I believe. Yes, it's shooting out in the x-axis. So if you wanted to shoot negative x, all you need to do is change the velocity direction to -1. And that could just save you a little bit of time when you're spawning particles on the fly. What else? Where was I? Okay, yes, and then we also have the velocity strength. So if you want to shoot these faster, you would do so like that. We'll add the gravity back down, and we can shoot them further out. Again, less is usually more with these numbers, but there's no clamp on them, so you can set them to what you like. And again, you can get some cool bleeding effects just by changing it to lower. And this sort of effect coming out of the arm after it's shot off would probably look pretty nice with an animation. And they scale on top of each other pretty nicely as well. So the other two variables I have here are the collision timer offset now and the collision bounds. So the collision bounds just increases the size of the particle collision, which can be handy if you're getting some collision errors or it's colliding through something it shouldn't be colliding through because it's very thin. Usually you should be able to leave this at 1, but I've included it there just in case people need to adjust it. The important part for update 1.2 was the collision timer offset. So if you set this to 1 second, it's not going to start colliding for 1 second. So if we move this further up, there we go. After 1 second it will collide, but if I change this to 2 seconds, again it's back to not colliding. So why would we want to disable the collision on these particles? So quickly I'm going to go through some of the limitations.